This video is brought to you by Women in Parenthesis, a project exploring the work of Iris Murdoch, Philippa Foot, Elizabeth Anscombe, and Mary Midgley. To find out more about us and access worksheets and podcasts about these four amazing philosophers, visit us at womeninparenthesis.co.uk. Iris Murdoch and Plato's Cave. Who was Iris Murdoch? She was a philosopher and author who lived from 1919 until 1999. And she left academic philosophy to focus on writing novels, a career which brought her enormous success. But before she did that, she wrote some work that helped to revolutionize moral philosophy in the 20th century. This work was mainly concerned with moral philosophy and was part of a revival of virtue ethics, which changed the way that everyone thought about ethics. Similarly to ancient philosophers like Plato and Aristotle, Murdoch was interested in the question of how human beings should live. And she talked about these philosophers, especially Plato, in a lot of her work. Today we're going to see what she had to say about Plato's allegory of the cave. She thought that our characters could be improved through imaginative engagement with art and literature. And we'll see a little bit more about why she thought that later. Now, Murdoch was very interested in the role that images and metaphors play in philosophy. She thought that the great philosophers of the past often used pictures and stories to great effect to think about our most important ideas. She thought that some of our most important thinking uses imagery. And I'm not just talking about philosophers here. This is a feature of the kinds of beings that we are, that we think in terms of images and metaphors. So, for example, think about the ways that we talk about time. We say that time flies, that it goes by quickly or slowly, that time flows, or we talk about the passage of time. We talk about something being behind us or happening way back, and we look forward to something exciting that's happening tomorrow. Now, we barely notice it because it's such a basic feature of how we talk, but all of these ways of talking about time use metaphors and images involving space and movement. In fact, scientists have done some studies on this where people with writing systems that go from left to right think of the past as being off to the left and the future as off to the right. With people who have writing systems that go right to left, they tend to think about it the other way round. Now, philosophers can sometimes be suspicious of imagery and metaphorical thinking. But Murdoch thinks that it's a totally essential part of how we think, and that it ought to be an essential part of how we do philosophy too. Philosophy, she thinks, should partly be about examining and modifying our images. And this is partly why she chooses to focus on Plato's Republic, especially the image of the sun and the idea of the fire in Plato's cave. Plato uses images of light, both sunlight and firelight, to talk about some very abstract and important ideas. So before we move on to talking about Plato, can you think of any metaphors involving light that you might use? What do you think it usually represents? So let's talk about Plato's cave. Plato uses the image of the cave in the Republic. And in this story, because it is a story, prisoners are chained to the wall in a cave. Behind them, there's a fire which is used to project an elaborate puppet show onto the wall of the cave. Guards walk up and down a road just behind the prisoners, and they're carrying these big cutout shapes which look like people, animals, and other objects. And the flickering images of these shapes are cast onto the wall in front of the prisoners. Now, this strange form of theatre has been all that the prisoners have ever known. They've been in the cave their whole lives in the half darkness, and they've never seen anything other than these moving shadows on the wall. So we're then asked a question. Would the prisoners be able to tell that there was a reality beyond the shadows, or would they mistake the puppet show for real life itself? So, what do you think? Would there be any way to know that what you were seeing wasn't real? Do you think that the prisoners would feel like they were missing out on anything, or that their lives were diminished in some way? But what happens when a prisoner gets free from his chains? Well, at first, he turns around, and the light of the fire is so bright that it hurts his eyes, and he just wants to turn back to the familiar images that he knows. But then he starts to see that the shadows on the cave wall are just shadows. They're images cast on the wall by the fire that he can now see. Everything that he's known up till now has not been real. But he doesn't want to stay by the fire, so he leaves the cave and escapes out into the sunlight. And at first he is dazzled by the brightness of the sun. But soon he looks around and he starts to see real animals, real humans, and other objects. And he sees that those puppets that he'd seen in the cave were only representations of the real things. And he can now see all of those real things in glorious technicolor lit up by the sun. And eventually, once his eyes become accustomed to the daylight, he can turn around and look at the sun itself. Not recommended, by the way. But now there's a plot twist. So the prisoner wants to go back to the cave. Why would he want to do that? Well, he's realized that the real world is a big, beautiful, exciting place. And he feels that his fellow prisoners ought to know about it. They're stuck back down there in the darkness looking at these puppets. But he knows that those things aren't real. He wants to tell them what the real world is like. So he goes back to the cave, but now he can't see anything because it's so dark. And the prisoners, not knowing anything about the sunlight and the glorious reality of the world, are just worried about their friend. So they conclude that he's been blinded by whatever it is out there and that it's going to be very dangerous to leave the cave. Now, obviously, we're dealing with metaphors and symbols here. So, what does all this mean? Well, the prisoners represent ordinary people who don't see beyond the superficial appearances of things. So they take everything that they see at face value. Now, Plato reckons that a lot of our commonplace understandings of things are just wrong, and that there's a greater reality beyond them. Now, escaping from the cave means that you see what is behind the appearances of things, and you see truth rather than illusion. When the prisoner sees the fire and the puppets, he understands that what he thought were real things were just illusions. And when he gets out of the cave, he sees the real things that those puppets represented. And eventually, looking at the sun, he sees the thing that allows us to see everything else. So we know that this is all about truth and illusion, and about coming to understand the reality of things. But why do you think the departure from the cave happens in two stages? And what do you think the first stage of the fire and the second stage of the sun represent? So think back to before when we were thinking more generally about how we use metaphors involving light. Okay, so here's what Iris Murdoch thought about it. Light is what allows us to see things, but it doesn't always do this in the same way. So sometimes light shows us shadows or tricks of the light, while at other times light illuminates something fully and allows us to see it properly. The firelight in the cave is used to create an elaborate illusion, while the sunlight outside allows the escaped prisoner to look at things properly. Now, Murdoch thought that the fire represents the self. So the prisoner who gets this far, who turns around and sees the fire, recognizes that a lot of commonplace understandings are actually what we project onto things. They're not in the things themselves, they're what's in our heads. They say more about us than about the things themselves. So think about when you see everything in terms of yourself. You might make all kinds of mistakes, like, for example, thinking that everything exists for your benefit or that everyone is out to get you. But in reality, you're only one small part of a much bigger world. And by stepping outside of your own ideas and laying your own concerns aside, you can sometimes think about stuff a lot more clearly. Now, in contrast to the fire, Murdoch thinks that the sun represents the good. So the prisoner shouldn't dwell by the fire, which represents the self, but needs to get beyond himself to see the truth of things. And the light of the sun, like the good, is what allows all other things to be known. Now, this might not seem obvious, and it is a bit of a tricky idea. So why is the good needed in order to see things truthfully? Well, for Plato, and indeed for Murdoch, there's an essential connection between truth and goodness. So goodness for them is the source of all truth. The idea of the good is essential for knowing any other ideas. So the good is what allows us to look at things properly, just like the light of the sun allows us to see the objects around us. But looking at the good itself, like looking at the sun, is harder. And that's why that's the final stage of the prisoner's journey out into the world. So, if the light of the fire, which creates illusions, represents the self, and the light of the sun, which allows us to see things truly, represents the good, then understanding goodness and truth involves something that Murdoch calls unselfing. So, if the prisoner had stayed by the fire, that would represent seeing that his previous ideas had been based on an illusion of his own making, but then just continuing to look inward, continuing to think about himself rather than getting past himself and understanding the bigger reality of things. So, we not only need to see that our ideas are often based on our own projections, but we need to move beyond that to see what's really there. Sometimes we might realize that we've been looking at things through our own bias or preconceptions. But it's a further step to try and see past that and understand how things really are independently of that bias. And this is what Murdoch calls unselfing. It's a project of turning our attention outward and looking at what's really there. So, how do we go about unselfing? Well, in a way, this sounds really straightforward, doesn't it? Because it's just a process of looking at what's there. But as we all know, it isn't that easy. So we're all somewhat prone to getting wrapped up in our own concerns and thinking about the world in relation to us. So, how do we get past that? Well, Murdoch thought that one way that we could do this was through the experience of beauty, whether that was through engaging in art or through beauty in the natural world. Both of those things, she said, allow us to forget about ourselves and to appreciate something that has a goodness all of its own. So she gives a really nice example of this. So she talks about looking blankly out of the window when she's in a troubled state of mind and she's all wrapped up in her own problems. But suddenly, out of the window, she sees a kestrel hovering in the air, and she gets completely caught up in watching this beautiful bird. And once she turns back to what had been troubling her before, her problems suddenly seem less significant. The sight of beauty in nature has removed her from herself, and it's allowed her to look at the world independently of her own concerns. Maybe you've had some experiences like this yourself. Now, similarly, Murdoch thinks that through art or literature, we can also be transported and we can see things through a different set of eyes. So when we read a novel, we go into a different world. We engage with characters who aren't ourselves, and we look at the world from their point of view. And again, our attention is taken away from ourselves. All of these things, she says, can help us go about this process of unselfing, to look at the world more clearly so we're not wrapped up in ourselves. So here are a few questions to think about. Do you think that analogies are a good way of doing philosophy? Can you think of any other philosophical analogies from your own studies? What do the different stages of Plato's cave analogy represent? Think about the prisoners locked up in the cave, think about escaping and looking at the fire and the puppets, going out into the sun, and then eventually returning into the cave. Now, Murdoch focuses a lot on the fire and the sun, but she talks less about the return to the cave. So what do you think about that? Why do you think the prisoner returns, and what do you think that tells us? Why does Murdoch think that unselfing is important? And do you agree with her? What do you think is the connection between truth and goodness that Murdoch is trying to bring out? How does beauty come into it? Finally, do you think that art and literature has an important role to play in discovering truth or understanding goodness? Alternatively, you might want to think about the role of beauty in the natural world. So that's all for now. You can learn more about Iris Murdoch at womeninparenthesis.co.uk. Goodbye.